Welcome to Navigating the Vortex, a deep dive, big picture analysis of contemporary geopolitics and geoeconomics. Today, as Trump looks set to abandon Ukraine peace efforts, Europe must step up to face Russian aggression alone. By Richard Whitman and Stefan Wolf. Donald Trump appears to have had a major change of heart regarding Ukraine. On the face of it, it looks like he has embraced outright optimism that Kyiv is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. However, this came with a message that Europeans will need to be in the driving seat to make this happen. According to Trump, a Ukrainian victory depends on time, patience, and the financial support of Europe and, in particular, NATO. The only US commitment is to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them. Most tellingly, Trump signed his Truth Social missive off with, "Good luck to all." This is perhaps the clearest indication yet that the US president is walking away from his efforts to strike a peace deal. It also suggests that he has given up on a separate deal with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. But this is where the good news ends, and where the European-led coalition of the willing will need to deliver security and stability for the continent in an ever more volatile environment. After several weeks of Russian incursions into NATO airspace, drones, thought highly likely to be linked to Russia, twice disrupted Danish airspace in the vicinity of Copenhagen Airport. It felt like a presentiment of the dystopian drone wars predicted by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in his speech at the UN General Assembly in New York on September 24. Putin's continuing provocations are a brazen challenge to Kyiv's European allies. At the heart of this coalition of the willing, the European Union certainly has demonstrated it is willing to flex its rhetorical muscles to rise to this challenge. EU institutions in Brussels have never left any doubt about their determination that Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine needs to end with a just and lasting peace for Ukraine, as Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, put it most recently in her State of the Union address. Beyond rhetoric, however, the coalition of the willing is facing a number of potential problems. Individually, none of them is insurmountable, but taken together they illustrate the unprecedented challenge Kyiv's European allies are facing. To begin with, the coalition of the willing is not a coherent body. Its membership includes members of NATO and the EU, as well as Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. But the United States is not among their number. It grew from 8 countries plus the EU and NATO in February 2025, to 33 participants in April, and 39 in September. Its relationship with the 57-member Ukraine Defense Contact Group of countries supporting Kyiv with military equipment, which held its 30th meeting in early September, is not entirely clear. The lack of coherence in membership in the coalition of the willing is mirrored by different levels of commitment, whether that's the willingness to deploy a reassurance force after a ceasefire in Ukraine, or the capacity to do so. It's also not entirely clear whether the leaders of the EU and NATO are speaking for all members of their organizations. Among EU and NATO members, Hungary and Slovakia, for example, have taken ambiguous stances when it comes to defending Ukraine and Europe against Russia. These different levels of commitment also reflect partially conflicting priorities. European members of NATO are deeply, and not wrongly, concerned about US abandonment. Add to that fears of a disastrous trade war, and placating Donald Trump becomes a priority. Doing so by buying US arms may please Trump and plug gaps in Europe's ability to supply Ukraine. But it is perhaps not the best way of ensuring the urgently needed development of an independent European defense industrial base. Trump's return to the White House swiftly ushered in the end of US largesse in support of Ukraine. Europeans have only partly filled that gap, with Germany taking the lead and the EU mobilizing over €10 billion in its current budget to 2027, with the aim to supplement efforts by member countries. But it's not clear how long these efforts will be sustainable in light of inflation and domestic spending pressures. France's public finances are in distress, while Spain has openly defied NATO's 5% spending target. Part of the solution to these problems would be much swifter defense industrial cooperation across the coalition, including with Ukraine. Over time, this could help to build the indigenous defense industrial capacity needed to produce military equipment at the scale needed. But making up for critical gaps in manpower, dealing with the Russian drone threat, strengthening air defenses and long-range strike capabilities, and replacing the potential loss of US intelligence support will not happen overnight. Individual countries and the various multilateral forums in which they cooperate will need to decide how to balance 3 only partially aligned priorities. Europe, whether defined as EU, European NATO members, or the core of the coalition of the willing, urgently needs to upgrade its defenses. Developing a European defense industrial capacity at scale is integral to this. Europeans also need to keep the US engaged as much as possible, literally by buying Trump off, because they currently lack critical capabilities that will take time for them to develop themselves. And while building better defense capabilities for themselves, they will need to keep Ukraine in the fight against Russia to keep it from losing the war. Europe needs to increase the money, develop the military muscle, and build decision-making mechanisms that are not mired in procrastination to win the proxy war that the Kremlin forced on Ukraine and its allies. To do so will ensure that Europeans are best placed to prevent Russia from broadening its war against Ukraine into a full-blown military confrontation with the West. A big thank you to all of our readers, listeners, followers and subscribers. Signing up to the newsletter is the best way to make sure you don't miss out on anything, and you'll get our newsletter and podcast delivered straight to your inbox wherever you are in the world. Importantly, you'll also be able to read the full written version of all of our pieces, which gives all of the background links to the information we cite in case you want to dive deeper and, like us, like to look at primary sources and check your facts. You can register for free at navigatingthevortex.com. You can also subscribe for subscriber-only access to comments and chats and other special subscriber-only benefits. You can find all these details in the podcast show notes as well. We hope you'll share Navigating the Vortex with anyone you think might find it of interest. If you like the show, please consider rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you are listening.